They were selling a man and a boy for $5. The morning air in Bozeman, Montana was so cold it felt like swallowing glass. Frost coated the rafters of the auction platform in the square behind the jail, and every breath you took came out looking like a ghost. A crowd was huddled there, not for warmth, for the show. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed, faces sour with judgment. A rusty bell clanged once, a dead sound in the frozen air. "Bring them out," the sheriff barked. Two figures stumbled out of the jail's side door. A deputy shoved them forward, a little too proud of his job. One was a man, tall and bearded. His face was a map of bruises, his coat was torn, and his wrists were bound tight with thick hemp rope. The other was a boy, maybe 5 years old. He had wide, terrified eyes that didn't blink, and he was clutching a little wooden horse in his hand so hard you'd think the splinters would draw blood. The whispers started right away. "Got no papers. Calls himself Boone. Ain't that the name of some railroad fella back east? Probably a liar. Look at his boots. Eastern made, but beat to hell." The man didn't say a word. He just stood there, his back straight and his lips split open and bleeding. He stared out over the crowd, his gaze fixed on something far away, like he wasn't really there at all. From the edge of the gathering, Clara Wells wrapped her arms tighter around her middle. It wasn't modesty, it was instinct. The swell of her unborn child pressed against her spine, a quiet, constant reminder. You're still here, you're still standing. Her coat was patched, her boots were second-hand, her body was tired down to the bone, but her eyes were sharp, and her breath was steady. She hadn't come for this. She'd come for a sack of flour, maybe some nails if she had anything left over. But now, seeing that man and that boy being sold like cattle, she couldn't look away. Something was wrong, not just cruel, fundamentally wrong. The sheriff stomped onto the platform. "Town ordinance," he announced, his voice booming, "allows for the auction of unregistered persons for labor to pay their fines and food costs. This man and his son have no identification, no known origin, and no money. Caught him sleeping behind Ruth Templeton's barn, squatting, stealing, vagrants. You all know the law." The crowd grumbled its agreement. Starting bid is $5 for the pair. Silence, then a chuckle from the back. $5? Couldn't even feed a mule on that. The man on the platform shifted. It was a tiny movement, almost nothing, but he angled his body just enough to shield the little boy from the crowd's view. That small gesture hit Clara like a punch to the gut. Protection. Even here, with nothing left in the world, he was still protecting his child. "Anyone?" the sheriff asked, getting impatient. Nobody moved. Clara looked down at the cloth purse clutched in her hand. Inside were 2 coins, 3 crumpled bills, and a small tin button from her late husband's coat. $5. Her last $5. A voice climbed out of her throat before she could stop it. "I'll take them." The words hung in the frozen air. Gasps scattered through the crowd like dry leaves. She felt them more than she heard them. A pregnant widow with no man to her name had just offered to buy a stranger and his child. The sheriff squinted, his eyes disappearing into the weathered creases of his face. "You sure about that, Mrs. Wells?" "I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't." Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried across the square like a hammer strike. Her spine was pure iron. "You got the money?" She walked forward. The crowd parted for her like she was a ghost. She placed the crumpled bills and coins into the sheriff's outstretched hand. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. It was the tremor of finality. There would be no flour today, no nails, no small comforts. "Fine," the sheriff grunted. He pulled out a knife and sawed through the rope binding the man's wrists. "They're yours." The crowd erupted in whispers again, heads shaking, lips curled in sneers. The man rubbed his raw wrists but said nothing. He didn't thank her. He didn't even look at her. The boy looked up at Clara with those wide, haunted eyes, then quickly looked down at his wooden horse again. They followed her out of the square in complete silence. The walk back to Clara's cabin was only 30 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The man limped, favoring his left leg. The boy's tiny boots scuffed patterns in the frosted dirt. Nobody spoke a word. When they reached the rickety porch of her small cabin, Clara finally turned, resting a hand on her lower back. "I don't know who you are," she said, her voice steady, "and I don't care what they said you did, but in my house, you will treat that child with care, and you will not raise your voice." The man just stared at her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I understand," he said. And his voice, it wasn't the rough, gravelly voice of a drifter. It was smooth, educated. There was something Eastern in the way he spoke, the words rounded and clipped at the same time. She had just spent her last $5 on a man who spoke like a king, and she had no idea the trouble she'd just invited through her door. Clara pushed the cabin door open. "It's not much," she said, "but there's clean water and a stove." Inside, the single room was small but tidy. A pot of bean soup was bubbling over a low fire, and the air smelled of wood smoke and thyme. It was the smell of survival. Clara gestured toward a simple cot in the corner. "That's your bed. He can sleep with you, or by the hearth where it's warmer." The man didn't move. He crouched down, getting eye level with the little boy. His voice was soft now. "Sammy," he said, "this lady has given us shelter. You need to say thank you." The boy Sammy didn't speak. He just looked from his father to Clara. After a long, tense pause, he did something unexpected. He held out the little wooden horse, an offering. Clara's throat tightened. She knelt down, her own body aching, and gently touched the worn wood. "You keep it," she whispered. "It's a fine horse." The man stood up again. His eyes met hers. "I'm Elias," he said. "Clara," she replied, giving a small nod. For the first time since the auction, they really looked at each other. She saw a man who was hurting, not just in his body, but somewhere deep in his bones. He saw a woman standing on the very edge of collapse, but somehow still standing tall. That night, as a light snow began to dust the prairie, Clara sat at her small wooden table, writing a letter by the flickering light of an oil lamp. It was a letter to her sister, trying to explain the unexplainable. Elias sat across from her, silent, holding a chipped mug of warm water. He watched the pen scratch across the paper. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, urgent. "I need you to send a letter for me in the morning." Clara paused. "A letter?" "To a Mr. Alden Pike. He's in New York." She looked at him, the lamplight carving shadows onto his bruised face. "What should I tell him?" Elias leaned forward. His eyes were dark, intense. He looked like a man about to change the world or burn it down. "Just tell him Boone is alive." He paused, and his jaw flexed. And the others failed. Clara's hand froze over the paper. Boone, the name from the crowd, the railroad fella. "Your name," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Is it?" "Elias Boone," he confirmed. And just like that, the entire story changed. The man sleeping by her fire wasn't a beggar. He wasn't a vagrant. He was a ghost the world thought was dead. A very important, very wealthy ghost. And the people who made him a ghost were still out there, somewhere in the dark. The next morning, the world was white and silent. A thick blanket of snow had fallen overnight, muffling every sound. Clara stood on her porch, a thin wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching Elias by the woodpile. He was trying to chop wood, but every swing of the axe made him wince. His breath came out in ragged white puffs. He was hurt worse than he was letting on. Inside the cabin, little Sammy sat near the warm stove, tracing the edge of his wooden horse with one finger. He still hadn't spoken a full sentence, but the terror in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He was a survivor, just like the two adults trying to hold this fragile world together. Elias finally gave up on the axe and limped toward the porch, brushing snow from his torn coat. "Is there a postmaster in town you can trust?" he asked, his voice low. Clara didn't answer right away. She was studying the way he moved. It wasn't just the limp. It was the tension underneath it all, the coiled readiness of a man used to being in control, a man who was now utterly powerless. She recognized it because she wore it herself every single day. Mr. Devlin at the general store, she said finally. He's a kind man. He won't ask questions if you pay the postage. Elias nodded and handed her a sealed envelope. I wrote it last night while you slept. It needs to be sent as soon as possible. Clara took the letter. The paper was crisp, expensive. The address was written in a precise, elegant hand. Alden W. Pike, Esquire, Manhattan, New York. This was no drifter. He'll know what to do? She asked. Elias looked out at the endless expanse of snow-covered prairie. He'll move the world if he has to, he said. And he'll know I wouldn't have written unless it was a matter of life and death. Clara tucked the envelope deep inside her coat pocket. Then let's hope the world isn't too far from Bozeman. The walk into town was slow and cold. The narrow trail was flanked by skeletal trees, their bare branches reaching like twisted fingers toward the gray sky. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and the growing weight of their shared secret. At the general store, Clara handed the letter and the exact postage to Mr. Devlin. The old man just tipped his hat. Weather holds, this might take 2 weeks just to clear the Rockies, he muttered apologetically. Mail coach to Cody is slow this time of year. 2 weeks, an eternity. Clara didn't tell Elias about the delay. What was the point? On the walk back, as the cabin came into view, Elias finally broke the silence. I wasn't traveling for leisure, he said quietly, as if the words themselves were a heavy burden. There's a parcel of land near Helena. I intended to purchase it. Clara glanced at him. What's so special about a piece of land in Helena? It's not much now, he admitted. Just rocks and scrub, but it sits squarely in the path of the future Great Northern Railroad. She stopped walking. Her boots sank into the snow. You know that for a fact? He met her gaze, and his eyes were steady and calm. I know that, he said, because I am one of the men funding its construction. Clara felt her heart skip a beat. He wasn't lying. She could see it. It was the kind of certainty no beggar could ever fake. Then why? She asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Why were you sleeping behind a barn? Why let them put you on that platform and sell you like an animal? Elias looked toward the distant, jagged mountains. Because, he said, his voice turning to ice, someone meant for me to disappear before I ever reached that land. They started walking again, the silence now charged with a new kind of danger. Who? She asked. I have my suspicions, he said. There's a man who owns a great deal of this valley, controls the local bank. He doesn't take kindly to outsiders interfering in his business. A cold dread washed over Clara. She knew exactly who he was talking about. Thaddeus Crane, she said, the name leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. Elias turned to her, his expression sharp. You know him? Everyone knows him. She looked down at her worn boots. My husband, Thomas. He had a small loan with Crane's bank. After he died in the mine collapse, I went to Crane to ask for a delay in the payments. She took a shaky breath. Crane offered to forgive the entire debt. All I had to do was sign over the rights to our back acre. He said it wasn't suitable for farming anyway. Elias stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes narrowed. That back acre. It wouldn't happen to border the old postal trail, would it? Clara's blood ran cold. She nodded slowly. Yes, it does. Elias let out a long, slow breath. The steam plumed in front of his face like smoke from a dragon. He's not just buying land, Clara. He's positioning himself. He's trying to steal the railroad. They walked the rest of the way in a heavy, brooding silence. When they got back, Elias went straight to the woodpile and began chopping, ignoring the shooting pains in his ribs. He split log after log with a fierce, controlled violence. Men like Crane, he grunted, the axe falling with a clean thwack. They think we're just pieces on a board. They move us around for their own gain. He swung again, splitting a thick log perfectly in two. They forget what happens when the pieces start moving on their own. That night, as the wind howled outside, Clara served a simple stew. After supper, as she mended a tear in her coat by the fire, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. Why didn't you just tell them who you were at the auction? Why not shout your name? Elias stared into the flames. Because a name means nothing when you're covered in dirt and blood. No one would have believed me. The kind of man I am doesn't just wander into Bozeman dressed in rags. He paused, his gaze distant. Not unless he's running. Are you running? She asked softly. No, he said, turning to look at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. But someone made damn sure it looked that way. Clara's hands fell still in her lap. She thought about her husband, Thomas, about the mine, about the convenient offer from Crane, about her backacre bordering the postal trail, the mine collapse that made her a widow. Suddenly, it didn't feel like bad luck. It felt like a murder. And the man responsible was the most powerful man in the entire territory. The snow was beginning to melt a few days later when Thaddeus Crane came to call. He didn't arrive on a simple horse. He came in a gleaming black buggy, pulled by a sleek, coal-colored gelding that looked like it belonged on a city street, not a muddy country lane. The polished wheels crunched on the thawing soil, and the whole expensive rig looked grotesque and out of place next to Clara's weathered cabin and crooked fence. Clara was in the root cellar, sorting the last of her potatoes, when she heard the carriage. She climbed out slowly, her hand instinctively going to her lower back, bracing herself against the sudden chill in the air. The sight of that buggy made her stomach turn over. Crane stepped down before his driver could even move to help him. He was a big man, dressed in a long, fur-lined coat and expensive leather gloves. His white hat was pristine, too clean for a man who claimed to live off the rugged Montana land. His smile was slow and sharp, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Mrs. Wells," he said, tipping his immaculate hat. His voice was smooth as silk, and just as cold. "I was in the area. Thought I'd stop by and see how you're managing, what with your condition and the hard season." Clara folded her arms over her belly. "I'm managing just fine, Mr. Crane." Crane's gaze drifted past her, to the cabin window. Elias was visible inside, sitting at the table with a pen and paper. Little Sammy was leaning on his shoulder, but the boy quickly turned away when he saw the stranger outside. Crane's smile never wavered, but his eyes sharpened. "I heard you made a rather charitable purchase at the town square," he said, his voice dripping with false civility. "2 more mouths to feed and not a man to back you. That's a risky choice for a woman in your position." Clara's cheeks flushed with anger, but her voice remained level. "I didn't ask for your opinion, and I don't need your charity. I didn't come to give it," he said, stepping one polished boot onto her bottom porch step. He was invading her space. "Only to offer you a way out. I'd be happy to take that man off your hands. I have a need for laborers on my west fence line. I imagine he'd prefer steady, paying work to whatever arrangement you two have settled into." The implication hung in the air, ugly and intentional. "He's not for sale," Clara said, her voice like flint. Crane chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "Everything is for sale out here, Mrs. Wells, especially people." Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Elias stood in the doorway. He was calm, unblinking, holding a simple dish towel in one hand, but the way he stood there, he filled the entire frame. He was no longer a broken man from an auction block. He was a wall. "I think it's time for you to leave," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. Crane blinked slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the man before him. "Well, well, you've got some manners for a fella who wears shoes with holes in them." Elias didn't rise to the bait. He just stared, and in that stare, Crane saw something that made his own confidence flicker for just a fraction of a second. Crane tilted his head. You You look familiar. Can't quite place it. Maybe you've seen me in your nightmares, Elias replied, his voice flat and cold. That wiped the grin right off Crane's face. He turned his attention back to Clara. Well, the offer stands. Should you change your mind? He started to turn away, then stopped. Of course, there's always the town ordinance to consider. If he were to cause any trouble, or if someone were to claim he's an escapee from another jurisdiction, well, the sheriff would have no choice but to investigate. You know how these things go. The threat was unmistakable. I know exactly how they go, Clara shot back. Crane gave her one last lingering look, then stepped down from the porch and climbed back into his opulent buggy. Watch yourself, Mrs. Wells, he called over his shoulder. Winter's not kind to those who are alone and unprepared. He rode off, leaving a trail of mud and menace behind him. Elias stepped out onto the porch as the sound of the carriage faded. You all right? I've dealt with worse pests, she muttered, though her hands were trembling. They went back inside. Elias set the dish towel aside and picked up the pen again. The sheet of paper in front of him was covered in small, careful script. What is that? Clara asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It's everything, he said. Everything I can remember from the documents they stole from me. Maps, names of investors, acreage numbers. He tapped a spot on the paper. Crane's name is on at least 3 of the letters I was carrying, disguised as a third-party broker. He was playing both sides against the middle. Clara stepped closer, her eyes wide. If that's true, then he's the one who had you attacked. He tried to have you killed before you could expose him. Elias nodded grimly. I was supposed to meet a railroad surveyor just west of here. When I didn't show up, the surveyor would assume I had pulled out of the deal. Crane would then swoop in with forged deeds and buy the land for pennies on the dollar. What can we do? Clara whispered. It's your word against his. I need proof, something tangible. But until Alden gets my letter and sends help, that could take weeks, she cut in. Maybe longer. We don't have weeks. I know. Just then, little Sammy, who had been hiding in the corner, walked over to the table. He pointed a small finger at the paper full of names and lines. What's that? He whispered, his first words in days. Elias looked down at the boy and his hardened expression softened instantly. It's our land, Sammy, he said gently. Or, it was supposed to be. Sammy leaned his head against Elias's arm, a simple act of trust that spoke volumes. Clara watched them, a fierce, protective feeling rising in her chest. This wasn't just about land or money anymore. It was about this little family, forged in crisis, standing against a man who would burn the world down for profit. She went to the stove and stirred the pot of broth. Her voice was firm when she spoke again. Then we don't wait for help to arrive from New York, she said. We start asking the people in this town who else Thaddeus Crane has robbed blind. The Chinook wind came a few mornings later, a warm, strange breath that swept through the valley and began to melt the snow in messy, slushy patches. It felt like a false spring, a trick of the weather. Elias was at the table, as always, staring at his reconstructed maps and lists, a man trying to rebuild his stolen life one line at a time. A sharp, fast knock echoed from the front door. Clara answered it cautiously, her hand hovering near the heavy cast-iron skillet she'd left on a nearby shelf. But it wasn't Crane or his cronies. It was a young boy, maybe 12, his cheeks red from running. He was breathing hard and holding out a folded, dirt-smudged scrap of paper. This is for the man with the beard, the boy panted. Said he'd pay $1 for it to be delivered quiet-like. Elias was at the door in an instant. He took the note and pressed a coin into the boy's hand. The runner vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. Clara shut the door against the wind. Who was that from? Elias unfolded the note. His eyes scanned the lines and his jaw tightened. It's from Alden, he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. The letter made it. He must have wired someone in Helena, who got word to a contact here. That was incredibly fast, Clara said. Elias gave a faint, grim nod. Faster than I ever expected, He says he's already sent a lawyer, a man named Collis, to the county office to start digging into the land records. He looked up from the paper, his eyes burning with a new intensity. He's found something. Clara leaned closer. What? What did he find? Irregularities, Elias said, his voice low and hard. Forged signatures, missing titles, just like we suspected. But he found something else, Clara. Something big. He paused. Crane hasn't been filing the original deeds. He's been keeping them. The real ones. Locked away in a private vault in his own bank. It's completely illegal. Clara's mind raced. So if we could get our hands on those, we could prove everything. We could unravel his entire empire. But how? Elias murmured, staring at the note. How do we get into a bank vault? They both turned as Sammy came wandering in from his corner, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. A fragile peace settled over the room as Clara poured him a cup of warm milk. For the rest of the day, they moved with a new sense of purpose. Clara went into town, pretending to shop, but really, she was listening. And the town was whispering. People were talking about Crane's visit to her cabin. They were talking about the stranger she'd bought. But now, the whispers had changed. Fear was being replaced by questions. Ruth Templeton had been in the general store asking Mr. Devlin if he remembered seeing her late husband's deed. One of the Turner brothers, who'd lost his store to a foreclosure he swore he never signed, was demanding a second audit. The tide was beginning to turn. When Clara returned to the cabin, her shawl damp from the melting snow, she saw something on the table that made her stop in her tracks. It was a small, worn leather wallet. "Elias, what is this?" she asked. He looked up from his papers, his expression confused. "I don't know. I've never seen it before." It hadn't been there when she left. She picked it up. It felt heavy, important. She opened the flap gently. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the wet, were papers. A folded deed, water-damaged but still legible, several letters, and at the very bottom, a birth certificate. Elias Nathaniel Boone, born Albany, New York. Clara gasped. "Elias, these are yours. These are the documents they stole from you." He shot to his feet, crossing the room in 2 strides. His hands trembled as he reached for the papers, his face a mask of disbelief. "Where did this come from? I didn't bring it. It wasn't here." They both stared at the wallet as if it were a supernatural object. It was impossible. Then Clara's eyes shot to the window. She saw it for just a second. A dark figure on horseback, sitting at the far edge of the trees, watching the cabin. The figure raised a gloved hand in a gesture that wasn't quite a wave, but a signal, an acknowledgement. Then it turned the horse and melted back into the deep woods. She looked from the empty tree line back to Elias, her heart pounding. "Someone wants you to win," she whispered. Elias was staring at the documents, his face pale. Some of them had the notary seal of his lawyer, Alden Pike. Alden must have sent someone. A secret agent, moving through the shadows, delivering the one thing that could bring Thaddeus Crane to his knees. Clara's voice was tight, urgent. "Then we use them," she said. "We use them right now." That night, they walked to the back of her property, where the old postal trail cut through the trees. Meltwater dripped from the bare branches, a steady rhythmic beat like a ticking clock. Elias knelt and pressed his hand into the muddy earth. "This is it," he said. "This is the route. The railway will follow this exact path." "Crane knows that," Clara said. "And now he knows you're alive and you have your papers. He won't just let you walk into a courthouse." "He won't have a choice," Elias said, looking toward the faint orange glow of the town in the distance. "A cornered wolf is dangerous, but it's also predictable. It's time we stopped reacting to him. It's time we made him react to us." The next morning, Elias walked into town alone. He wore a clean coat Clara had painstakingly patched for him. His beard was trimmed. His stride was no longer the limp of a broken man, but the confident gait of a man on a mission. Little Sammy watched him go from the window, his small hand pressed against the cool glass. Clara didn't try to stop him. She just said, "Be careful." The bell above the door of the Bozeman Bank and Trust chimed softly as Elias stepped inside. The air was thick with the smells of cedar, ink, and money. "I need to speak with Mr. Crane," Elias said evenly to the young clerk at the front desk. The clerk hesitated. "Mr. Crane is not seeing anyone." "Tell him," Elias said, his voice dropping, "that Elias Boone is here to see him." The name worked like a magic word. The clerk's eyes went wide, and he scurried to the back. Seconds later, Thaddeus Crane emerged from his office. He wasn't smiling. His eyes were like chips of ice. "I heard you were lost," Crane said, his voice a low growl. "I was found," Elias replied coolly. Crane studied him, taking in the clean coat, the determined set of his jaw. "You look different." "I found a mirror." They stared at each other across the polished wood of the bank counter, two titans preparing for war. Then, Elias reached into his coat. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out the folded, water-stained deed. He laid it on the counter with deliberate care. "I believe," Elias said, his voice resonating through the silent bank, "that you have something that belongs to me." Crane didn't even blink. "I'm quite sure you're mistaken." "I'm quite sure," Elias said, leaning forward slightly, "that a federal judge will disagree." A tiny muscle clicked in Crane's jaw. It was the only sign that the blow had landed. "Get out of my bank," Crane hissed. "I'll leave," Elias said, picking up his deed, "but I won't be empty-handed for long." He turned and walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "You made a mistake, Crane. It wasn't stealing my land or trying to kill me." He turned back, his eyes locking with Crane's. "Your mistake was leaving me breathing." He walked out into the sunlight, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Across the street, Clara stood with Sammy, pretending to look at a display in the general store window. She watched Elias step out of the bank and let out a long, slow breath. She rushed to his side. "What happened? What now?" Elias looked back at the bank, a grim, determined smile playing on his lips. "Now," he said, "we give him just enough time to panic. Because a cornered man always makes a mistake, and Thaddeus Crane is about to feel very, very cornered." The days after Elias's confrontation with Crane were thick with a strange, heavy silence. But beneath the silence, the town was buzzing. Word spread like wildfire. The quiet stranger Clara Wells had bought for $5 had walked into Thaddeus Crane's bank and faced him down. People whispered about it at the general store. They leaned in close over the barber's chair. They watched from the windows of the town's only cafe. Maybe, just maybe, the king wasn't untouchable after all. Elias stayed close to the cabin, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Every move now had to be a chess move. He spent his days comparing his reconstructed notes with the miraculously returned documents, building a case brick by brick. At night, Clara would quietly convince another downtrodden landowner to come forward. A widow whose farm had been seized over a mysterious tax lien she'd never heard of. A former shopkeeper who said he signed loan papers with Crane's clerk, a man named Harvey Rusk, but had never seen Crane's name on a single document until the foreclosure notice arrived. One by one, they were stitching together the story of a rot that went to the very heart of Bozeman. On the fifth morning, a rider came. He wore a sheriff's badge, but it was the town sheriff, Duncan Molly, a man who walked with the particular swagger of someone who had been on Crane's payroll for years. He dismounted and stomped onto Clara's porch, a folded paper in his hand. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Clara Wells," he said, his voice flat. "You're hereby summoned to appear before the county registrar on Monday. Charges are pending regarding the unlawful harboring of an unregistered laborer." Clara didn't even flinch. "You mean Elias?" Molly smirked, a nasty little twist of his lips. "That's the one." Just then, Elias stepped into the doorway behind her. He held a piece of paper in his hand. His deed. "I am not a laborer," Elias said, his voice calm and clear. "I am a landowner, and I have the deed to prove it." Molly didn't even glance at the paper. "That's not what the official county records say. Funny thing about records, your name ain't in the book, and until it is, you're nobody." Elias's jaw clenched. "And who, Sheriff, controls the book?" Molly just tipped his hat, the smirk never leaving his face. "I don't write the rules. I just deliver them." He shoved the summons into Clara's hand. "You don't appear on Monday. The federal marshals will come for you, and they won't be as polite as I am." He turned and mounted his horse without another word, leaving them standing there with the flimsy piece of paper that was meant to be their doom. Inside, Elias paced the small cabin like a caged lion. "He's accelerating," he said, running a hand through his hair. "He's trying to force a legal judgment here, locally, before Alden's lawyers can arrive from the East Coast." Clara looked at the summons, then at Elias. "Which means we need to move faster, too." But then Elias stopped pacing. He looked at Clara, and a different kind of fear entered his eyes. A deeper one. "Clara," he said slowly, "there's something I haven't told you. About Sammy." Clara's heart went still. She looked over at the boy, who was quietly playing by the fire. He was always so quiet, so watchful. "What is it, Elias?" Elias took a deep breath. The story he was about to tell was heavier than any deed, more dangerous than any land dispute. "When they ambushed me on the trail, I wasn't alone. My business partner was with me, a good man named Marcus Thorne." He paused, the memory clearly painful. "The ambush was for both of us. They shot Marcus. He died right there." "Oh, Elias," she whispered. "But here's the thing, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Marcus had brought his son with him on the trip, a boy he adored." Clara's eyes darted to the little boy by the fire, to Sammy. Her blood ran cold. "Elias." "No." He nodded, his face etched with grief and a terrible burden. "Sammy isn't my son, Clara. He's Marcus Thorne's son. He was there. He saw the whole thing. He saw the men who murdered his father." The room seemed to shrink. The crackling fire, the wind outside, it all faded away. The little boy with the wooden horse wasn't just a child Elias was protecting. He was a witness, the only living witness to the murder of his own father. And Elias had sworn to the dying Marcus that he would protect the boy no matter the cost, even if it meant being sold on an auction block, even if it meant facing down Thaddeus Crane. Now, Crane wasn't just a thief, he was a murderer, and the key to his destruction wasn't in a land deed. It was playing quietly by the fire, a little boy who had seen far too much. That night, they held a secret meeting in Clara's drafty barn. A handful of townsfolk, the ones who had lost the most and had the least left to fear, gathered in the flickering lantern light. Elias stood before them, not as a drifter, but as a leader. "I didn't come here looking for a fight," he began, his voice low but ringing with conviction. "But Thaddeus Crane brought one to me. He brought one to all of you. He has fed on your grief and your struggle for too long." The men and women listened, their faces grim, their arms crossed. "I have proof," Elias continued, "of stolen deeds and forged signatures. But I need more. I need your voices. I need you to be willing to stand up and speak the truth." A tense silence followed. Then old Ruth Templeton, leaning heavily on her cane, spoke up. "My Henry couldn't write his own name, but Crane's foreclosure paper said he signed it clear as day. I'll testify." Another man spoke. "My loan payment wasn't due for another 3 weeks when the sheriff showed up and evicted my family." One by one, they found their courage. By the time the lantern burned low, Elias had 10 sworn affidavits. It wasn't enough to convict a man like Crane, but it was enough to light a fire. The next morning, another letter arrived. This one was from Alden Pike, his script tight and hurried. "Elias, Crane has moved faster than we anticipated. He has filed a claim against your title with the Office of Territorial Affairs, citing abandonment. He's trying to cut us off. We've sent counter documents. Hold your position. Help is on the way. Elias read the letter and tucked it into his pocket. They're coming, he said to Clara. But they won't be here by Monday. That night, a feeling of dread settled over the cabin. They sat in the near dark, only the fire in the hearth pushing back the shadows. Elias was showing Sammy how to fold a piece of paper into a little boat. Clara watched them, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach. For a brief, peaceful moment, it almost felt like they were a real family. But they weren't. Not yet. And outside, in the darkness of the tree line, a figure was watching the cabin. It was Harvey Rusk, Crane's bank clerk. He scribbled something in a small black notebook, his face a mask of conflict. Then he slipped back into the trees, a ghost caught between two worlds. Clara looked at Elias, her heart heavy. Monday, she said. He's going to use the law to crush us. Elias looked from the fire to the paper boat in his hand, then to Sammy's sleeping face. A cold resolve settled over him. Then we won't fight him with the law, he said. We'll fight him with the truth. Because come Monday, they weren't just defending a piece of land. They were avenging a murder, and they were going to expose Thaddeus Crane for the monster he truly was. Monday dawned gray and cold. A tense stillness hung over Bozeman. The sky was the color of lead, promising snow but holding back, as if the very weather was holding its breath. Clara stood before the small, cracked mirror in her room, smoothing the sleeves of her best dress, a simple navy wool. She had braided her hair tightly and pinned it with a silver comb that had belonged to her mother. She didn't look scared. She looked like a fighter. She needed that image to hold. Elias stood beside her, adjusting the collar of his patched coat. The bruises on his face had faded, but the weight in his eyes had only grown heavier. He glanced toward the back of the cabin, where Sammy stood clutching his wooden horse, his small face a mask of worry. Mrs. Holloway will watch him, Clara said softly. She has 4 of her own and more sense than any man on the town council. He'll be safe. Elias knelt down to Sammy's level. You stay close to Miss Mary, you hear me? Be a good boy. Sammy just nodded, his eyes wide. Then, he reached into his little pocket and pulled out the folded paper boat Elias had made him. He pressed it into Elias's hand, a silent promise. I'll bring it back to you, Elias said, his voice thick. He tucked the small paper boat into his breast pocket, over his heart. The ride into town was silent and grim. The county registrar's office was already buzzing. A crowd of townsfolk stood outside, some curious, some hopeful, some just waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Sheriff Molly leaned against the porch railing, his arms crossed, a smug look of satisfaction on his face. The inside of the courthouse smelled of dust, old paper, and stale pipe smoke. A long oak desk divided the room. Behind it sat the county registrar, a balding man with nervous eyes. Standing next to him was a man in a crisp gray suit. Clara recognized him as one of Crane's lawyers from Helena. Clara Wells, the registrar called out, his voice flat. You are here to respond to the charges of unlawfully harboring a non-registered worker and interfering with the property rights of Mr. Thaddeus Crane. Elias stepped forward before Clara could speak. His voice was not loud, but it filled the entire room. Objection! Every head in the room turned. The registrar blinked. My name, Elias said, his voice calm and resonant, is Elias Nathaniel Boone. I hold a federally recognized and notarized deed to 127 acres of land along the Helena corridor. That land was never transferred, never sold, and never vacated. It was taken from me through theft, fraud, and coercion. The lawyer in the gray suit chuckled. Strong words for a vagrant. Do you have proof of these fantastic claims, Mr. Boone? Elias reached into his coat. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out the worn leather wallet. He laid the papers on the desk, one by one, with deliberate care. My birth certificate, my land title, stamped by the territorial office in 1874, 3 notarized letters from my legal counsel, Alden Pike, senior partner at Pike and Bramley of New York, and, he added, placing the final document on the pile, a copy of the Great Northern Railway Easement Agreement, signed under the Northern Development Act of 1876. The lawyer's smirk vanished. He snatched up the papers and began to scan them, his eyes growing wider with every line. This doesn't explain your status as a vagrant, he stammered. I was attacked outside of Livingston, Elias said, his voice ringing with authority. I was beaten, robbed, and left for dead. When I awoke, I had no identification and no way to send for help. That is, until Clara Wells saved my life. She did not harbor a fugitive. She offered Christian charity to a man who had been left to die in a ditch. Clara stepped forward, her voice firm and clear, and I would do it again. A stunned hush fell over the room. The lawyer turned to the registrar, his voice tight. We request time to verify these documents. The registrar looked at the federal seals on the papers. He looked at Elias's unyielding face. He looked at Clara's quiet strength. Then he looked out the open window at the growing crowd of townspeople leaning in, listening to every word. Request denied, the registrar said, his voice surprisingly firm. These documents carry federal notary stamps. If you believe they are forgeries, that is a matter for a higher court, not mine. Sheriff Molly, who had been enjoying the show, suddenly looked very uneasy. Then, the sound of heavy, confident boots on the wooden floorboards. Thaddeus Crane entered the room. He was not smiling. I hear you've been telling stories, Boone, he said, his eyes fixed on Elias. I only tell the truth, Elias replied. I suppose it sounds like a story to a man who lies for a living. Crane walked slowly toward the desk, his gloved fingers tapping against the wood. You think a few old papers and a pregnant widow are going to stop what I have built here? You didn't build anything, Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. You stole it, piece by piece, life by life. He took a step closer. You stole it from Ruth Templeton, from the Turner brothers, and you tried to steal it from my partner, Marcus Thorne. But you didn't just steal from him, did you, Crane? Crane's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. You had him murdered on the trail, Elias's voice was a blade, and his son saw it all. A collective gasp went through the room. The whispers from the crowd outside turned into a roar. Crane's eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. His lawyer touched his arm, whispering something urgently. For a moment, it looked like Crane might lunge across the desk, but then, realizing the entire room had turned against him, he straightened his coat. You're making powerful enemies, Boone, he hissed. Elias just shrugged. I've had worse. Crane then turned his venomous gaze on Clara. And you? You think this ends with him riding off a hero, leaving you with nothing but a farm full of fairy tales? Clara stepped up beside Elias, her chin held high. I don't need fairy tales, Mr. Crane. I just need the truth. And it seems to me we finally have that. Crane looked like he wanted to strike her, but something in Elias's stance, a cold, deadly promise, stopped him. Without another word, Crane spun on his heel and stormed out of the courthouse. The registrar cleared his throat, his voice shaky but clear. Given the legitimacy of the documents presented and the other serious allegations raised, this case is dismissed. Mrs. Wells, you are free of all charges. Mr. Boone, your property records will be submitted to Helena for immediate reinstatement. Cheers erupted from the crowd outside. Clara let out a breath she didn't even realize she'd been holding. As they stepped out into the weak sunlight, the town looked different. The people who had once sneered at them now nodded with respect. Suddenly, a small figure came barreling up the road. It was Sammy. He ran right past Clara and threw his arms around Elias's legs, holding on for dear life. Elias crouched down and pulled the boy into a fierce hug. You kept your boat, Sammy whispered into his shoulder. Elias pulled the crumpled paper boat from his pocket. I told you I would. From the porch of the general store, old Ruth Templeton raised her cane in the air. "It's about time someone knocked that man down a peg," she yelled, and the crowd laughed. But as Elias stood up, his face was still serious. He looked at Clara. "This isn't over yet," he said quietly. "No," she agreed, taking his arm, "but it's a start." The snow returned 3 days later, wet and heavy, blanketing Bozeman in a thick, smothering silence. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Inside Clara's cabin, the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of a war room. Elias had received a sealed message that morning, delivered by a grim-faced rider from Helena. It was from Alden Pike himself. "Marshal en route. Arriving Friday. Have all witnesses and evidence ready. Crane will not go quietly. Be prepared. Friday." That was 2 days away. "How many do you think will actually show up to testify?" Clara asked, stirring a pot of stew that she didn't feel like eating. Sammy was by the fire, drawing pictures in a patch of spilled flour on the floorboards, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around them. "Enough," Elias said, his voice tight with concentration. He was packing documents into a small leather satchel. "They've seen Crane's power crack. Fear is a cage, Clara, but hope is the key. They'll come." That afternoon, they began to arrive. Ruth Templeton, leaning on her grandson's arm, the two Turner brothers, their faces pale but resolute, a wiry ranch hand named Doyle, who'd lost his entire herd to one of Crane's phantom liens. The barn became their headquarters. Elias tacked maps to the wooden beams, marking each parcel of stolen land with a red pin. Each pin was a family, a farm, a future that Crane had tried to erase. Clara stood beside him, watching him work. "This is bigger than just us now, isn't it?" she whispered. "It always was," he said, not looking up. "It just had to start somewhere." That evening, as dusk fell, Elias stood at the window, staring out at the darkening woods. "I keep thinking about that first night," he said softly. "Lying in the cold behind that barn, bleeding, so certain I would never see another morning." He turned to her, his eyes dark and intense. "And then you were there." "I didn't save you, Elias," she said, stepping beside him. "You were already fighting to survive. I just gave you a place to land." "It was enough," he said. The silence between them was thick with everything they hadn't said, everything they hadn't had time to feel. A sudden, sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. Elias moved instinctively in front of her. He opened the door a crack. It was Harvey Rusk, the bank clerk. He looked terrible. His face was pale and slick with sweat despite the cold. He clutched a heavy, wrapped bundle under his coat, and his eyes darted around nervously, never meeting theirs. "I'm not here to spy," he said quickly, his voice a ragged whisper. "I'm here because I've had enough." Clara stepped back, and Rusk stumbled inside, shivering. He laid the bundle on the table and unwrapped it. Inside were ledgers, Crane's private bank ledgers. The pages were filled with Crane's own handwriting, records of payments to Sheriff Molly, notes in the margins detailing how he had falsified dates and altered deeds. It was a confession in ink. Elias stared at the books, his eyes wide. "Where did you get these?" "I've been keeping copies," Rusk admitted, his voice trembling. "For years, just in case. At first it was small things. I told myself it wasn't my business, but then he started destroying people. Good people. I have a family, Mr. Boone. I couldn't live with it anymore." "Why now, Harvey?" Clara asked gently. "What changed?" Rusk finally looked at her, his eyes full of a desperate fear. "He knows," he whispered. "He knows the marshal is coming, and he knows I've been keeping records. He came to my house last night. He threatened my wife, my children." The blood drained from Clara's face. "He's planning to leave," Rusk choked out. "Tonight. He's loading a wagon with all the original ledgers from the bank. He's going to take them out of town and burn everything. He'll disappear, and there will be no proof left." Elias exchanged a single hard glance with Clara. The marshal was 2 days away. By then, Crane and the evidence would be gone. "We can't let him," Clara said, her voice a steel wire. We won't, Elias replied. That night, under the cover of the swirling snow, a small posse rode into the sleeping town. Elias, Clara, Harvey Rusk, his face set with a grim new courage, and two other ranchers who had lost everything to Crane. They tethered their horses in a dark alley behind the bank. The building was a stone fortress, silent and imposing. Elias knelt by the rear storage shed door, a place where Rusk said Crane kept his most sensitive documents. Using a set of tools he'd fashioned himself, he worked on the lock. The tumblers clicked, one by one. The door swung open into darkness. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and deceit. Clara held a lantern high as Rusk led them to a hidden room behind a false wall. It was Crane's secret archive. Wooden cabinets lined the walls, filled with duplicate deeds, unsigned foreclosure notices, letters detailing the conspiracy. It was the entire criminal enterprise, laid bare. They worked quickly, bundling everything they could carry. Just as Elias pulled the last, most damning folder from a locked drawer, they heard it. The creak of the outer door. Footsteps. Voices. It's him, Rusk whispered, his face ashen. It's Crane. Elias motioned for silence, pushing them all behind a tall filing cabinet. They crouched in the darkness, their hearts pounding, their breaths shallow and loud in the enclosed space. Through a thin crack, Elias saw Crane enter the main storage room, followed by Sheriff Molly. They'll never trace it back to us, Crane was saying, his voice confident. By the time that marshal gets here, I'll be 3 territories away, and all this will be ashes. And the Boone fellow? Molly asked. I'll deal with him my own way before I leave, Crane sneered. A loose end that needs tying up permanently. He walked directly to the cabinet they had just emptied. He unlocked it. He opened it. His face contorted in disbelief, then rage. Where is it? He roared. Where are my ledgers? Elias didn't wait. He burst from behind the cabinet, slamming his shoulder into Crane with a force that sent the bigger man crashing against the stone wall. Molly fumbled for his pistol, but Clara was faster. She swung the heavy lantern with all her might, smashing the metal handle hard across the sheriff's wrist. The gun clattered to the floor. Don't move, Elias growled, pressing his forearm against Crane's throat. Crane struggled, spitting with fury. You think this changes anything? You're still nobody, Boone. Just a drifter who got lucky. No, Elias said, his voice cold as the grave. I'm the man who's going to testify at your trial. Molly was groaning on the floor, clutching his broken arm. Clara kicked the gun away into a dark corner. Harvey Rusk stood over them, holding the stolen ledgers like a holy text. We have everything, Thaddeus, Rusk said, his voice no longer trembling. It's all here. The color drained from Crane's face. He finally understood. He had lost. They bound both men with rope from the supply closet and shoved them into Crane's own private soundproof vault. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it would buy enough time. As they rode out of town, the first hint of dawn was breaking on the eastern horizon, turning the falling snow a soft, pearly gray. Clara looked over at Elias, her face illuminated by the growing light. Now what? He let out a long, frosty breath, the weight of 100 lifetimes seeming to lift from his shoulders. Snow clung to his beard, and his eyes were tired but shining with a fierce, triumphant light. Now, he said, we finish it. The snow was still falling when U.S. Marshal Theodore Lancaster rode into Bozeman the next morning. He came on a powerful black gelding, his deputy close behind, both men looking like they were carved from the granite of the mountains themselves. The townspeople emerged from their homes and shops, a silent, watchful audience. They had heard the whispers, the rumors of a showdown at the bank, but they didn't truly believe it until they saw the federal marshal dismount in front of the courthouse, a rifle slung across his back. Clara stood on the courthouse steps, Elias beside her. Little Sammy clutched his father's hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. The marshal tipped his hat. You, Elias Boone? Elias nodded. I am, sir. Pike sent word ahead, Lancaster said, his voice a low rumble. Said there was some trouble, fraud, stolen property, and a very angry banker currently locked in his own vault. For the first time in a long time, Elias allowed himself a small, dry smile. That's all true. Lancaster looked him up and down, his eyes missing nothing. Then let's see the proof. Inside the courthouse, Harvey Rusk had laid everything out. The ledgers, the forged deeds, the affidavits from the townspeople. Ruth Templeton was there, leaning on her cane, her voice strong and clear as she told her story. The Turner brothers stood side by side, their fear finally replaced by a shared resolve. Lancaster flipped through Crane's private ledgers, his expression grim. "This handwriting," he said to Rusk. "Does it match the signatures on the official county transfer forms?" "Yes, sir," Rusk confirmed. "Thaddeus wrote it all himself. He'd alter the records after hours. Sheriff Molly helped enforce the fake liens and turned a blind eye to the evictions." Lancaster grunted. He turned to Elias. "You brought me a storm, Mr. Boone." "I didn't bring it," Elias said evenly. "I've just been walking in it longer than most." Just then a wagon pulled up outside. A group of ranchers brought Crane and Molly in, their hands bound, their faces a mask of sullen, bruised pride. The sight of them, powerless and defeated, drew the entire town into the square. Lancaster wasted no time. He stood before the two men in the center of the courthouse. "Thaddeus Crane, Duncan Molly," his voice boomed. "By the authority of the United States government and the territory of Montana, you are hereby remanded into my custody under suspicion of federal fraud, conspiracy, land theft, and complicity in murder." Crane didn't speak. He just stared across the room at Elias, his eyes burning with a bitter, impotent fire. "You think you've won," he hissed. "I didn't come here to win," Elias replied quietly. "I came here to stop losing." That night, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the lights in Bozeman burned bright. Clara's small cabin was filled to bursting with warmth and laughter. The long table was laden with food people had brought: venison stew, fresh-baked bread, hot coffee. Neighbors who had been isolated by fear now sat shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in a chorus of relief and renewed hope. Elias stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching. He watched Clara laughing at a story one of the ranchers was telling. He watched Sammy, finally asleep by the hearth, safe and sound. He watched the community that had been broken begin to heal itself. When Clara noticed him, she came over, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "Are you staying?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Elias hesitated. "I have to go to Helena," he said. "I have to testify. Pike's firm needs my signature on 100 documents. I have to rebuild what Crane broke." She waited, her expression unreadable. "But I'd like to come back," he said, his voice soft. "Not just to visit, but to build something. Here." Clara smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that lit up her whole face. "There's room," she said. "Plenty of it." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple gesture, but it was a promise, a foundation. A few days later, Elias rode out with Marshal Lancaster, but he didn't leave in rags and shame. He left with his name cleared, his land secured, and a future to build. Clara stood at the gate of her little farm, with Sammy waving beside her. She didn't cry. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he would keep his word. Spring came late that year, slow and stubborn, but it came. Wildflowers pushed their way through the thawing soil. The sun lingered longer in the sky. And one morning, as Clara was hanging laundry on the line, her belly now round and full, she heard the distant, familiar sound of hooves. She turned, a hand shielding her eyes from the sun, and she smiled. Elias was riding up the lane. He was clean-shaven, and his coat was new, but his eyes were the same. Behind him was a wagon, loaded high with fresh lumber, tools, and 2 strong new horses. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft spring earth. "For the new barn," he said, nodding toward the wagon. "And maybe a porch swing." Before he could say another word, Sammy came barreling out of the cabin and launched himself into his arms. Clara walked toward him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Welcome home," she said simply. Elias looked around, at the small cabin, at the greening fields, at the wind moving through the tall pines. Then he looked at her, and at the boy who was his son in every way that mattered, and at the home they had forged together in the fire. "I am home," he answered. From that day forward, they didn't look back. They built the barn. They built the porch swing. And together, they built a life. The town of Bozeman healed, not overnight but slowly, like a bone setting right. And whenever anyone doubted that one person could make a difference, they would remember the story of the pregnant widow who bought a stranger at auction and how that single act of courage rewrote their entire world. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because you never know what secrets are hiding in plain sight, just waiting for someone brave enough to bring them into the light.